the Institute for the Study of Peak States presents the second International Psychoimmunology and Psychobiology Research Symposium. Dietary and Holistic Strategies to Achieve Peak Brain Performance, presented by Professor Brant Cortright.
Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Brant Cortright. He's the author of the Amazon #1 bestseller, Holistic Healing for Anxiety, Depression, and Cognitive Decline. He's Professor Emeritus with the California Institute of Integral Studies. Dr. Cortright is a licensed clinical psychologist with a private practice in San Francisco. He's also an online coach and consultation practice focused on brain health, anxiety, and depression. He's the author of 3 previous books, the Neurogenesis Diet and Lifestyle, also a #1 Amazon international bestseller, Psychotherapy and Spirit, and Integral Psychology, Yoga, Growth, and Opening the Heart. It's a pleasure to have you here, Brent. Oh, you're still on mute. I'll unmute you, I think.
Okay. Now can you hear me?
Yes, we've got you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be with a group of people who are interested in peak brain states. I've been writing in the brain optimization space for some years now and have been focused on what prevents peak brain states, peak brain performance. So this is a great forum. And I'm glad to be part of this with other people, like-minded people. So my current book is Holistic Healing for Anxiety, Depression, and Cognitive Decline. And what it really looks at is, why are people not in a peak brain state? I imagine that is in some ways the key issue in this entire conference. So a bit of context from my perspective. So the brain is always in movement, right? The brain is always, we think of the brain as a computer, but it's a terrible analogy because a computer is a dead, static piece of machinery. But the brain is like a living organism. It's almost like a slow-moving amoeba. It's always in motion and it's always growing, right? We've known for a few decades now about neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain forming new connections among existing brain cells. But in the past 15, 20 years, they've discovered that actually there's even more kind of growth that happens, which is the production of new brain cells called neurogenesis. Neurogenesis, they thought, stopped happening in our early 20s, and for decades, it was believed that it was just one slow die-off after that. And then it was discovered that actually we grow new brain cells throughout the entire lifespan until the day we die. So the brain is moving and growing at these 2 levels. Neuroplasticity, also called synaptogenesis, and neurogenesis, the creation of new brain cells. Now, when it was first discovered that the brain makes new brain cells, they didn't really understand the significance of it at first. But then they discovered that the rate at which we make new brain cells and new connections among existing neurons has a powerful effect on how we feel and how we think. One experiment was done by the discoverer of neurogenesis, Fred Gage, out of the Salk Institute, a neuroscientist down in San Diego, where he increased the neurogenic rate, right? The neurogenic rate is the rate at which the brain makes new brain cells and new connections, neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. He increased the neurogenic rate by 5 times in mice. And he created not quite super mice, but kind of close. These mice figured things out faster. They remembered things more quickly. They learned things more quickly. They were more creative. And they had robust emotional resilience. They were protected against stress, anxiety, and depression. They had big neural advantages over their normal neurogenic rate peers. This experiment has now been done in almost all mammals with the same effect. So one thing that also became clear in the early days of this research, about 10 years ago, was that in depression, the neurogenic rate slows way down. And it turns out the same thing is true with anxiety and with cognitive decline. So with anxiety, with depression, and cognitive decline, there are common neural mechanisms underneath the whole thing, primarily linked to this neurogenic slowing, which happens primarily in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is this crescent moon shaped structure. We have one on each hemisphere. We actually have 2 hippocampi, although it's usually referred to in the singular. So one part of this crescent moon processes new memories. It helps create new memories. The hippocampus doesn't store new memories. That happens throughout the brain. But the hippocampus processes new memories. So like in Alzheimer's, for example, which massively attacks the hippocampus, new memory formation stops or slows way, way down. And as memories diminish, the person's sense of self also diminishes. If you've been around somebody who has Alzheimer's, you can see it's like they're not there fully. It's like memory forms kind of the foundation of the self. And when that goes, the self begins to go. Executive function begins to go. Memory is hugely involved in executive function. So part of the hippocampus is involved in making new memories. The other half of the crescent moon is involved in emotion regulation, particularly the regulation of anxiety, stress, and depression. So when our neurogenic rate slows and neurogenesis slows down in the hippocampus, which is the main part of the brain that experiences neurogenesis, what we get brain fog, we get cognitive impairment, cognitive decline, we get stress, anxiety, and depression. Now, what I've come to see is that given the number of neurotoxins in our environment, just about everybody has some degree of neurogenic slowing, right? If you look at Wikipedia under neurotoxins, one thing you'll see is a list, 200 pages long, 30 neurotoxins on each page, 6,000 neurotoxins that Wikipedia lists, each with its own Wikipedia page. 6,000 neurotoxins that have never been in the environment before, brand new. Some of these we know about, like mercury, lead, arsenic, but some of them are brand new that we've never heard of. Different kind of plastics, for example. Everybody in America has measurable levels of plastics. Plastics are endocrine disruptors. They help promote cancer. Endocrine disruptors disrupt brain function in a very significant way and also cause neurogenic slowing. These forever chemicals like Teflon, again, pretty much everybody in the United States has these in their system. Smog. 90% of the world's population lives in smoggy air. The very small particles in smog, the 2.5 micron particles and smaller, cross into the lungs, into the bloodstream, and actually cross the blood-brain barrier, where they act like little wrecking balls in the brain, creating inflammation, creating oxidation, and neurogenic slowing. Some people think that up to 30% of Alzheimer's can be directly attributed to smog. Another neurotoxin is glyphosate, or the main ingredient in Roundup. Glyphosate is the most widely used pesticide in the world, in the history of the world. 300 million pounds of it are used every year in the United States. And it's used extensively in Brazil, in China, in India, throughout the world. Glyphosate is an antibiotic. And so one thing it does is wipe out the microbiome, which is a disaster for the immune system, since 80% of our immune system comes from there. But also, glyphosate opens up the tight junctions of the intestines. Now, the tight junctions of the intestines are what keeps out the bad stuff, but lets in the good stuff. So when you open up these tight junctions, you let in a flood of toxins into the body, which creates inflammation, right? And inflammation, of course, is behind most of the major illnesses: cancer, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, on and on. So when the tight junctions of the gut open up and let in these toxins, the tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier also open up. They respond to the same molecular signals. So glyphosate opens up the tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier, which lets in toxins into the brain, creating more inflammation and neurogenic slowing. UCSF here in San Francisco did a study a few years ago and found out that 93% of Americans have measurable levels of glyphosate in their system. It's probably closer to 100% by now. In certain parts of the Midwest and the South, it's in the dust. It's in the rain. It's so prevalent. If you eat out at a restaurant, unless you're eating organic all the way, including organic bread, you're getting glyphosate. Glyphosate is also used to desiccate wheat. Even though they don't use it on wheat as a pesticide, they use it to desiccate it when they harvest it. So glyphosate is, there's a ton of it in commercial meats, because commercial meats are fed GMO corn, soy, which are heavily sprayed with glyphosate. So we could go on for a lot more about all of the neurotoxins in our environment, but let me just stop there and say, okay, the problem is huge. It's a neurotoxic minefield out there. There are other things also that bring neurogenic slowing, such as infections, different types of infections, different types of toxicity, like mold as well. The book goes into a number of these, but a big portion of these comes from diet and air and water. So what do? One thing is to eat organically. If you eat organically, you'll cut out 80% of the pesticides. Because even organic food, due to drift, some of it has glyphosate in it. So the book goes into the physical brain healing and the psychological self-healing, right? We are psychophysical beings, right? We exist on these different levels. Neither one can be reduced together. It's one whole being that we are, but we have these different levels. And to make this even more differentiated, we have a physical body, we have an emotional existence, we have a mental existence, and a spiritual existence, right? Body, heart, mind, spirit. We exist on all these 4 levels, and we experience them all through the brain. The brain integrates these 4 streams of experience into a coherent whole, as does the self. So what we need to do is to increase our neurogenic rate once again, to get it back up to speed. So the book goes into the healthy brain diet. And a big part of this diet is a neurogenic diet. So there are about 40 different compounds, 40 different nutrients that have been discovered so far that have a very powerful effect on our neurogenic rate. Some of these things include hesperidin, which is a bioflavonoid found in citrus fruits, blueberries, very powerful effect on our neurogenic rate, apigenin, luteolin, quercetin. Again, these polyphenols are very powerful, and it's hard to get enough of them from food. We really need to eat a more concentrated version in a supplement. Also, omega-3s are very powerful. The neuroscientist Sandrine Thuret at the University of London increased the neurogenic rate by 40% simply by adding omega-3s to the diet. Now, omega-3 fatty acids, or fish oil, consists of ALA, EPA, and DHA. ALA we don't need to worry about. It's not converted to the other two, which are the important ones. EPA is a powerful anti-inflammatory. We want that. And DHA is the fundamental building block of the brain. So the brain is composed of about 60% fat. And of that, 30 to 50% of it is DHA. So we need to have 3 or 4 grams at least of high quality omega-3s every day. And if you have a low inflammatory level, you want a 1-to-1 ratio of EPA to DHA. If you have a high inflammatory level, which almost everybody does, you want a higher EPA amount to DHA. You want a 2-to-1 EPA to DHA. So a good test for everyone to get when you have your yearly physical is called a high sensitivity C-reactive protein. That's a general inflammatory marker. If your test is 0.5 and below for a male or 1.0 and below for a female, then you want an omega-3 formula that's 1-to-1, EPA to DHA. If you have higher than that, which most people do, then you want more EPA in order to reduce that inflammation. They did a series of studies with monkeys involving omega-3s. And they did one with raising young monkeys on a low omega-3 diet and another group of young monkeys on a high omega-3 diet, and then looked at their brains. And the low omega-3 diet monkeys had very simple, undifferentiated brains. But the high omega-3 diet monkeys had very complex, richly differentiated brains, almost like human beings. The single most important thing anybody can do for their brain health is to make sure you're getting a lot of good, high quality DHA and EPA, and be sure that your supplement is molecularly distilled, because mercury, which is, I believe, the second most powerful neurotoxin outside of plutonium, collects in fish. And so many of these fish oils are loaded with mercury, which you don't want. If you get it molecularly distilled, it won't have the mercury in it. How are we doing with time? 20 after. Okay. So there are 4 pillars that I go into of the healthy brain diet: neurogenic, low carb, anti-inflammatory, and gut friendly. We could go into each of these. They're all really important, but particularly increasing the neurogenic, they all work to increase the neurogenic rate. But the most important is these neurogenic nutrients. The other thing that's worth mentioning is about 80% of the population has some degree of insulin resistance, which means your blood sugars are higher than optimal. the higher your blood sugar, the faster your rate of cognitive decline. And the faster your neurogenic rate slows down, right? The lower your rate of your neurogenic rate. So most people, it's also helpful to get a hemoglobin A1C when you get your physical and just see. That's a snapshot of your blood sugar over the last 3 months. If your number is 5.0 or above, which the great majority of people is above, then you would do well to decrease your blood sugar level. And mostly this involves decreasing carbohydrates. And if you can go full on ketogenic for a while, all the better. A ketogenic diet is neuroprotective and is being used in clinical trials now with Alzheimer's and with cognitive decline. It's also great for anxiety and depression. Anti-inflammatory, we need to bring the inflammation levels down. There's a number of nutrients that do that naturally. And then gut-friendly. There have been shown to be certain probiotic strains that will decrease anxiety scores by 50%, and other strains which will decrease depression scores also by 50%, and certain other strains which have been shown to increase cognitive scores in people with a cognitive decline. So the book goes into great detail with all this, but making sure that we have a robust and diverse microbiome is really important. In indigenous cultures, they've got about 20,000 different strains. In the West, most people have 10,000 or less. Not good for our immune system, not good for our brain either. So increasing microbial diversity is part of this. But this is a holistic approach. So body, heart, mind, spirit, right? So there are also important emotional factors in increasing our neurogenic rate. So there are emotional neurotoxins, such as stress, such as bullying relationships, such as loneliness and isolation. Stress is one of these funny things. There's good stress and there's bad stress. Mostly it's talked about as a negative thing, but actually we need a certain amount of stress. But we need a certain kind of stress. We need stress that is moderate and short-term. That kind of stress strengthens us. That kind of stress challenges us. And because it's moderate and short-term, we can meet that challenge. And when we meet that challenge, we come forth with new potentials, with new abilities. We unfold ourself. We unfold our brain's capacities in that process. But I'm similar to like when we work out with a muscle, with hand weights or something, right? Moderate stress, and then you stop, and the muscle builds back stronger. Well, with stress, it's the same. Most people don't complain about moderate stress. They complain about chronic stress. And chronic stress slows your neurogenic rate to a crawl. Chronic stress at first decreases inflammation, but then it bounces back and it increases inflammation. It increases your blood sugar, and it makes so many of the systems go awry. So we get an increase in heart disease, we get an increase in cancer, an increase in diabetes, you name it. Stress can be implicated. So we want to make sure that we are in this kind of Goldilocks zone of optimal stress. Optimal stress is where our capacities meet the challenge and we are engaged, right? The brain wants to engage the world. It wants to unfold its potentials. And so if the stress is too much, it gets overwhelmed and we get frustrated. If it's too little, we get bored. That's not helpful either. The brain thrives on this optimal engagement, optimal challenge. That's where we come into the flow state. That's where we get these peak brain states. Loving relationships, which secrete oxytocin in the brain and dopamine, it turns out are highly neurogenic. In some ways, this comes as no surprise to probably anybody, but it's still interesting that the research shows that loving, supportive relationships are good for our brains. There are mental neurotoxins. For example, shouldism or self-critical talk. Self-critical talk, which I think is referred to as blame in the previous presentation, is a kind of autoimmune disorder, a kind of mental autoimmune disorder where the self attacks itself. And so there are ways of working with that psychologically, which are pretty effective. Then there are also spiritual neurotoxins. Having no meaning in life, for example, creates a kind of sickness of the soul in many people. And having a kind of belief that there is a harsh, judgmental God looking at us at all times is very stressful. Not good for the brain, not good for the sense of self. Turns out there are two different meditation practices which have been shown to have quite a robust effect on our neurogenic rate. And these two meditation practices are mindfulness practices and heart-opening practices. Both of these have very powerful effects on our neurogenic rate, on the entire length of the hippocampus. So there's also the psychological side here. So there's a lot of psychological issues involved with anxiety, very different psychological issues involved in depression, and the same with cognitive decline. With anxiety, we get things like PTSD. We get things like anxiety as an unconscious signal, type of signal anxiety. We get poor emotion regulation, inability to self-soothe, to self-calm. With depression, there are many different things, chronic inhibition being one of them, anger turned inward, dark night of the soul, a kind of psycho-spiritual depressive event or process. And with cognitive decline, there are emotional factors, there are psychological factors, and spiritual factors. Probably the most important mental factor in that is the process of learning, lifelong learning. The brain thrives on learning new things. Learning new things stimulates our neurogenic rate. Being at this online conference right now is stimulating your neurogenic rate by learning these new things. It's good for your brain. So, when our neurogenic rate is high, we get these peak brain states. It feels good simply to be alive. There's this sense of vitality, the sense of joy of simply being alive. And you can hardly wait to get out of bed in the morning and just meet the day, to meet the challenges of the day, to meet the other people in your life. When the neurogenic rate slows, we get just the opposite. It's like paddling upstream during a storm. We don't have as much energy, we don't have as much emotional resilience, and everything is harder. There's more stress, there's more anxiety, it's easier to get depressed, there's more brain fog. And again, my sense is that almost everybody has some degree of neurogenic slowing. And so when the brain becomes sluggish like this, when it slows down, peak brain states are very rare and few far in between. They almost don't exist. When we increase the neurogenic rate, then these peak brain states come back online pretty naturally. And when we then do personal growth and spiritual growth practices, then we have access to these states when we do some sort of inner work that supports this. So spiritual growth, personal growth, and brain growth, they all go together here. And I see I'm about out of time. I was supposed to go to 11:30, so let me stop here.
That's great. Thank you very much, Brant. Lots of great information there. I love the holistic approach that you have to this. Three of the questions were all very similar. They definitely caught on your recommendation around omega-3. So they were wondering whether you've got some good recommendations on brands to use, vegan quality sources, long chain versus short chain. So there's lots of questions around how do you recommend we get omega-3 into our diet?
Okay, good. Nordic Naturals is a good brand. They make a molecularly distilled line. And they also have one that is high in DHA called DHA Extra, which is great. Another good one is Life Extension Foundation, lef.org on the web. They have a good formulation. They're also molecularly distilled. If you're vegan, don't do flax oil. Flax oil is all ALA, and ALA does not convert to EPA or DHA hardly at all. I think it's like 8% converts in healthy 18-year-olds, and it goes downhill from there. They've tried experiments where they've tried to raise omega-3 levels by supplementing with flax oil, and they've been unsuccessful. So the only way, if you are a vegan, is to use algae forms of DHA and omega-3s. Algae forms are available, and that does convert to DHA and to EPA.
Okay, we've probably got time for one last question. So someone's asking around, what's your opinion around fasting and juicing?
Fasting is great. Fasting increases the neurogenic rate. Juicing can be problematic because most juicing turns out to concentrate sugar. And so when you get a sugar spike, like from drinking carrot juice, which is full of sugar, it's like drinking a Coke or something. It's almost no different in terms of blood sugar. So I think it's very problematic there. It depends what maybe celery juice would be okay, something very low sugar, but most juices you've got to be very careful of because of those sugar spikes, which really work against brain health and which increase insulin resistance.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you so much for your time. And with the answer to those questions, if you've got time to type in the response to the questions as well, given I don't have that information, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you once again.
Okay. Sure.
Okay.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Brent. So just a reminder to those in the audience as well, if you can submit your questions into the Q&A button, that way everyone can get a response to those questions, and it also makes it easier for us to make sure that we have answered them all. All right, so on to our next speaker.
Thank you for watching. For more information, visit brantcortright.com.